Life during the war. And the background today is actually a sign from the Confederacy asking people to join the Army. Freemen of Tennessee, the Yankee War is now being waged for beauty and booty. Booty in this situation means loot, from stealing things, not what today the word booty tends to mean in music. They have driven us from them and now say our trade must and will have. To excite their hired and ruffian soldiers, they promise them our lands and tell them our women are beautiful. That beauty is the reward of the brave. Tennesseans, your country calls. Shall we wait until our homes are laid desolate, until sword and rape shall have visited them? Never. Then, to arms, and let us meet the enemy on the borders. Who so vile, so craven, and not to strike for his native land? The undersigned propose to immediately raise an infantry company to be offered to the governor as part of the defense of the state and of the Confederate States. All those who desire to join with us in serving our common country will report themselves immediately. Come join the Confederate Army because the Northern Army is coming and they are going to rape our women and steal our land, is what that sign says. Try to get soldiers to join the Confederate Army. A little propaganda. First thing we're going to look at is women during the war. Because if you remember back, and I know it's been a while, you were to read this for Friday last week, 16:4, women's roles changed during the war. They began to do jobs that were considered men's work. For the first time, women started doing the jobs that were considered men's jobs. One of them, does anybody remember from the reading? One of them starts with an N and is related to one of the Civil War texts that we talked about in this class. Anybody remember? One of the jobs that was men's work up until this time when women started to do it. Starts with an N. Deals with one of the Civil War texts that we talked about. And I even gave you a picture of one of the kits that was used in that text. What job did women start to do during the war? Starts with an N. Yes, for the first time, women are nurses. I know that seems strange to you today because today the majority of nurses are women, but back then, the medical profession was something new, and women were not supposed to be nurses. How dare they be nurses? They'll see naked men, and that is forbidden. How dare they? They are going to see naked men. They're going to see men's arms. That is just rude. They're going to see men's legs. They are going to see men without their shirts on. Ladies and gentlemen, back then, how many people here know what a swimming suit is or a bathing suit? Okay, you know why it's called a suit? Do you know why it's called a suit? No. Because back in the day, swimming suits were full-blown from wrist to ankle, fully covered, men and women. Material, cotton, yeah. It'd be heavier if it was wool. Ladies and gentlemen, it was considered improper for ladies to see men's arms, men's legs, or men's chests uncovered. It was downright pornographic back then. Women were not allowed to see that on men. Same thing with the men, not supposed to see ladies' arms or legs. Boy, we have some issues if you look around this room today. We have some people that would be considered pretty much naked by showing off their legs or their arms. Short sleeve shirts, Shorts, Totally covered, wrist to ankle. Face was okay. So women that started to work as nurses were sort of looked down upon. It was improper for a proper lady to dare look at naked men. Naked being showing your arms, showing the legs, showing the chest. Not talking about pantsless. We're talking about shirtless, sleeveless shorts. That's what we're talking about. It was improper. A proper lady wouldn't want to look at that stuff, and she would not want to work in the situation where she's forced to look at this. This was something radical that women started to become nurses. Yes. What? Well, proper women wouldn't do that. If they were an improper woman, they would be looking at men's arms and legs. I know it's strange for you today, thinking about, and even just looking around the classroom. Look at the people wearing shorts, short arms, short sleeves. Yep. So here's a picture of one of the most famous women nurses from this time. Her name is Clara Barton. She eventually goes on to deal with the American Red Cross. Women back then, notice, fully covered, big hoop dresses. That's what you're supposed to wear, ladies. Women back then never wore pants. Never, ever, ever. Always dresses. Now, there's another job that they did that was typical of men's work, and that was being spies. They would not sneak around and hide in corners, but they would use their womanly charms on people to get information. They would trick gentlemen into revealing information about troop movements. One of the most famous women is a woman by the name of Belle Boyd, who ran a bar. She ran a tavern, and Union soldiers would come in, and she would talk with them, and she would get them to say things, and she would pass that information on to the Confederate Army. She was a Confederate spy, that is correct. So, women during the war, sometimes doing jobs that were only for men before. Nurses and spies are two examples. Now, people's rights during this war were put in jeopardy by one person in particular. Based on what we've talked about before, based on your reading, what did Abraham Lincoln do that restricted people's rights? Honest Abe. Remember, individual rights. What did Abraham Lincoln do? What did Honest Abe do with regards to people's rights? He arrested people that supported secession. He arrested people for what they believed in or what they thought. Goes against what? Arresting somebody for what they believe in or what they think goes against what? The Constitution. Freedom of expression, freedom of speech, all those freedoms. Lincoln did it to prevent opposition, to prevent people from speaking out against him, to prevent people from talking about secession. He basically suspended constitutional rights. We will not have freedom of speech. We will not have freedom of expression. It's my way or you're in jail. People that were planning to speak out against the war found themselves put in jail, put in prison, without a trial. They could not gather, no freedom of assembly. Lincoln did this. Why and where? Where did he do this primarily and why? Where did he do this and why? Maddie? Okay, good. He did it primarily in the border states, like around Maryland, and he did it so that we could not have Maryland secede and isolate our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. So he had a reason for doing it. Now, some people might say he had a good reason to do it, so it was a good thing. Other people might say every time you break the Constitution, it's a bad thing. That's a topic for debate, and even historians today still debate whether or not he should have done that. So, people's rights. Any questions on that? If you were asked what Lincoln did and why, you'd be able to answer that. Any questions? Oh, okay, moving on. Moving on, and the smart board is acting up today, so I need to go over here to the keyboard, to the mouse. Now, we're going to look at the two armies. We're going to start with the Southern Army. What were some of the disadvantages that the South had at the beginning of this war? We've gone over these many times. The entire last unit was talking about stuff like this. What are some of the disadvantages? Why would they have what? Why do you think that they would have a smaller army? Fewer states? Fewer states don't necessarily translate into a smaller army, but what would translate into a smaller army? Okay, a smaller population in general. Smaller population in general. What other disadvantages did they have? Jake? So they did not have as much industry as in the North. Why would that be a disadvantage? Okay, fewer weapons, fewer supplies. Okay, they had a smaller area to control. That can be both an advantage and a disadvantage because you don't have to spread your army out as much. Okay, their transportation system was poor. Now, if we go back to that population one, that's going to be evident here in the Southern Army because the South begins to force men into the Army. They begin to force them into the Army. And what is that called when you force people to join the Army? It has a name. What is that called when you force people into the Army? It's drafting. It's called the draft. And so the Southern Army starts the draft. And ladies and gentlemen, we do not have the draft today We do not have the draft today. However, gentlemen, when you turn 18 years old, you are required by law to go to the post office and sign up, fill out a form, and sign up for the draft in case Congress starts it again. Every male, when they turn 18, must register at the post office by filling out a form stating your name, where you live, your age, if you have a social security number. And if Congress calls up a draft, randomly selected people from that pool of men will be selected to go into the Army. Back then, they would take all the draft cards, put them together, and draw them by hand. Here are the people that are forced to go into the Army. Today, most likely, it is computerized. But we do not have a draft right now. However, all gentlemen must sign up so that if we do get a draft, you're already registered. Ladies, you don't have to. Ladies, you do not have to sign up for the draft, and you will not be forced into the military. Men can be forced in. Ladies, as of right now in this country, may not. In other countries, you are, but not in the U.S. Isn't that sexist? Some people would say yes. But other people will say, well, women are more delicate. Just like back then, remember back then, the women were so delicate they couldn't look at men's arms or legs? Because that was nasty. Also back then, ladies, you couldn't vote either. You couldn't vote until 1920 because men and many women said it was too stressful on your brains. Women even fought against voting rights. Please don't make me think so hard. My brain will overheat. A lot of women thought that as well, but there were some other strong women that said, wait a minute, no, that's just totally ridiculous. Women are just as smart as men, and they fought for women's rights to be able to vote. But back then, during the Civil War, you were too dainty, too delicate. Even though I know many women that could kick men's butts, even today, they're not forced into the draft. If we had one. Yes. You can choose to go into the Army, yeah. And back then you could choose too. At the beginning of the war, everybody was joining the Army. Yeah, everybody, hey, you guys, let's go. It'll be fun. Remember all that stuff we saw in those paintings? It'll be a fun time. Until suddenly, they were Jordan. Now, the Southern Army started doing this right at the beginning of the war because they didn't have enough soldiers. April 1862. April 1862, right when this war was starting. They started this. Now the men involved, the men that were selected, 18 to 35-year-olds. $39. Now, 18 to 35. Now, there are a couple ways to get out of this. One, you could hire a replacement. For example, let's say Devin got called up for the Southern Draft. And Devin has enough money and enough skills to convince Colin that here's some money, Colin, I'll pay you this amount of money, you go in my place. Both of you go down to the draft board. Devin says, my number was called. However, I've made an arrangement. Colin is going to go in my place. And then Colin goes. Colin gets the money from Devin, and Colin goes and joins up in Devin's place. That's one way of getting out of it. That's right, but doesn't necessarily mean that the person was thinking like that. Colin might be thinking, hey, look at all this money. I'm not going to die. This is going to be fun. Oh, there goes Jordan. Personally, from my vantage point, I would not, for any amount of money, go as a replacement. But it was an option out there that people did. Yes. Colin's name would not be picked then because he's already in. He would be known. He would be notified if he got picked. Colin. He wouldn't go for it. Now, the other exception is if you own 20 or more slaves. If you owned over 20 slaves, then you were automatically exempted because you needed to be on your plantation taking care of those slaves. Those are the two ways that you could get out of fighting in the war. Now, how much did a replacement cost? It all depends on what the replacement was charging. If it's give me 2 apples and we're good, okay, fine. 2 apples, there you go. Go fight the war for me. No way you do it for 2 apples. Oh well. 2 oranges? Okay, fine, 2 oranges. Now, the Northern Army. The Northern Army had the exact same kind of deal. They started forcing men into the Army. And raise your hand if you can tell me what that is called. When men are forced into the Army. Notice this is a review because we just had it on the last slide. I'm seeing who is paying attention and who is not paying attention. Molly. It is called the draft. Now the North does this a little different. They don't need to get more people into the Army until later in the war. They come into play in 63, March of 1863. So it's after Antietam, where McClellan lost all those men by just throwing them at the Southern lines. And it's also at this time that a lot of men in the North are no longer just saying, yeah, let's go join, let's jump on the bandwagon, it'll be fun. How many people have ever heard that term, jump on the bandwagon? Means everybody else is doing it, you're jumping on too? They actually had, during this time, a real bandwagon. Bands would go through the center of town, and there would be a wagon where recruits would jump up on there, and they would take those recruits to the recruitment office, and they'd go in and they'd sign up and join the Army. They would have beautiful women on the wagon to entice the men up, and they would go sign up for the military. They were literally jumping on the bandwagon. There was a band playing marching music to get everybody's attention. Now, eventually, people stopped joining and jumping on the bandwagon because they realized that people actually died. There goes Jordan again. It's no longer this fun thing to do with your friends. Now, the Northern Army also does it a little differently. 18-year-olds, you're safe. But when you turn 20 to 45 was the range. So yes, Colin, you would be happy I would be drafted in that. You did. When you asked what my age was, and you were not happy that I was out of the age for the Southern Army. Now, the North has exceptions as well. The North has exceptions as well. The same kind of deal. Same kind of deal. Alex gets drafted. Alex has lots of money, and so he pays AJ and convinces AJ to go in his place. If you hire a replacement, you're good to go. Now, can we have an exception in the North for if they have 20 or more slaves? Well, we could in only the border states, but for the most part, no. But we have another exception. If you pay the government, instead of paying a replacement, you pay the government $300. Now, oftentimes, when I give numbers like costs, people are like, "Well, that's not much." How much was that worth way back then? I found a website that will actually tell you. I found a web page that says, put in this year, put in how much money and the year that that money was used, and it will calculate the exact worth. And I did it. $300 in today's money would be approximately $5,300. Now, $5,300 is what you would pay the government. Most of you do not have $5,300 just lying around. I said most of you don't have. I did not say all of you. I said most. Now, $5,300 laying around. Who can tell me? Now think about this and look back at your notes if you need to. Ben? Look back at your notes if you need to. What do all of the exceptions have in common? What one group does not have to fight in this war based on the exceptions for both the North and the South? What one group gets a free ride on this war? Rich people. Rich people have enough money to buy a replacement. Rich people would have $300 or $5,000, $5,300 just lying around. Rich people would own more than 20 slaves. Who makes the laws? Who made these laws? Both the North and the South. Who made the laws? Rich people. So the rich people made laws to prevent rich people from having to fight in the war. Who started the war? The politicians, the rich people. Who ends up having to fight the war? The poor people do. Now, a lot of people say that the United States Army is the same way today. Because most of the people that join the Army tend to be people that looking for a free education because they can't afford it elsewhere. Oftentimes tend to be minorities. And so a lot of people say, even in our wars in modern times, it tends to be the poor people that do the fighting and the rich people that get to stay home. It was happening way back then, too. Any question about this? Okay, moving on then. There were a lot of riots that you read about in your assignment last week because of the draft. Men that were upset that they were being forced into the Northern Army to fight a war that they did not believe in. Many of them said, I don't feel like fighting for black people. Even though they thought the war was about slavery, but it wasn't. It was to keep the Union together. The New York riots happened in July of 1863. A lot of burning, fighting. Over 100 people lost their lives. People went through the streets, breaking into buildings, stealing things. They had to send part of the army in to stop it. They had to send part of the army in to stop the fighting. All because people's perception of war changed. No longer was it, hey, it's going to have a great time, we're going to go, come on, Jordan, come on, everybody, hey, let's go, it's going to be fun, and, there goes Jordan. Because of the new technology of what? people started to see what war was really like. Jordan, turning around. What new technology allowed people to see what war was really like for the first time? For the first time, people started seeing war because of photography. Yeah, it started changing their impressions. War wasn't this fun thing anymore. It was real. It was death. Here are some pictures from the most famous newspaper or magazine at the time, a publication called Harper's Weekly, showing images of the riots in New York City. They are drawings. They're not real photographs. But they are depicting what was going on in New York City at the time. Yep. There's an African American that was lynched, yes. Lynched, that's what it means when you string somebody up and hang them. Yep, that's called the lynching. Okay, we're going to look at the economies of both the North and the South. Economies, how people made money, what the money was worth. Now, during the war in the North, we'll start with the North. During the war, there was what is called inflation. Now, inflation, the easiest way to describe inflation is prices going up or price increases. And it naturally happens over time, where something that used to cost 25 cents 10 years ago might cost 30 cents today. Now, oftentimes, inflation is caused by shortages. During the war, the northern factories were making what? What were the northern factories making? Jake? Supplies and weapons for the soldiers, that's right. So they weren't making things for people to buy. So there were some shortages for the common people. And so inflation, by the end of the war, was 80% in the North. 80% inflation by the end of the war. Now, I'm going to give you an example, just to show you how inflation works. Let's just say that a loaf of bread at the beginning of the war cost $1. That is not the real price of bread back then. I'm just using it as an example. The bread cost $1 at the beginning of the war. By the end of the war, it cost, can anybody figure it out? At the beginning of the war, $1. At the end of the war, with 80% inflation, it would be, Alex? $1.80, that's right. That's a large increase. It's almost twice the price. Now, again, that is not the real price for bread. I don't know what bread cost back then. I'm just using that number as an example to show you how a price increases due to inflation. The northern economy, as a result of this war, was pretty good. It was booming. All the factories were fully employing people because they were making things for the war effort. Very little unemployment. The factories were working day and night, selling their goods to the government, and government was buying them. Made lots of people in the North rich. Even though prices went up 80%, overall, the economy in the North was great by the end of this war. Now, let's take a look at how the South fared with this. The South. They had major inflation. Not just a little, they had a lot. Caused by shortages thanks to the what? What part of the Anaconda Plan? What? Raise your hand if you have an answer. What part of the Anaconda Plan caused major shortages in the South? Major shortages in the South. Mitch? Blockades. Yeah, the blocking of the southern ports. No supplies in or out. Massive shortages in the South, which caused inflation of 9,000% by the end of the war. 9,000% inflation by the end of the war. Something that cost $1 would end up costing $90 at the end of the war. That same loaf of bread that was for $1 at the end would have cost $90. Most people couldn't afford things by the end of the war. Why do you think we talked about Lee's army going into the fields hunting for food? Because they didn't have it around. Extremely hard to find food. The economy was ruined. If you think about it, where was this war fought? Raise your hand. Where was this war fought? On the South's territory. So if any factories are destroyed, any fields are burned, any transportation systems are totally destroyed, it happens in the South. As a result, it ruins the economy. Thank you. It ruins the economy. And as you already know, what do you know about those Confederate soldiers in terms of supplies? What do you know about Confederate soldiers in terms of their supplies? What? Okay, they were stealing boots from people, from dead bodies. They were totally underfed and undersupplied. Thanks to the blockade, which also caused this massive inflation, 9,000%. A car that would today that would cost 10,000 would cost 900,000 as a result. That is really high. Ladies and gentlemen, life during the war was not pleasant for people in the South, especially as the blockade continued on longer and longer and longer. Yes? Why would they go to Mexico? No. This was 150, 160 years ago. We're not talking about you go to Mexico, they have cheap stuff there. Wasn't an option. Wasn't an option. There was no such thing as Cancun back then. People did not take vacations like that.